Welcome to episode 10 of season 11 of the Community podcast hosted by CivSource Africa. In this season, we've done a recap on the past 10 seasons of the podcast. It's been an amazing experience and an interesting journey listening into different leaders sharing their understanding of the diverse forms of giving and generosity across the continent. One of the biggest discussions happening around us currently is the conversation on climate justice and action. Season 10 of the Community podcast, CivSource Africa partner with Wings and the Philanthropy for Climate Movement. If you would be wondering what Wings is, this is a very good time to pause and just log into one of our social media platforms and listen into season 10, which is about climate justice and action. And you will get to start from there in an understanding of what Wings is like. So I will spare you the details for now. Our guest today isn't new to the season. I was privileged to host her a few episodes ago. If you're listening in, join me once again for yet another amazing episode with Madonna Vicky Ainembabazi, the Philanthropy Support Associate at CivSource Africa. Hi, Madonna. How are you today?
I'm okay. I'm fine, thank you, Antonio. How are you doing?
I am very, very well. Enjoying the warm temperature in Kampala. Are you in Kampala also?
Yes, I am. Where else would I be, Antonio?
So what has changed since the last time we met?
Nothing clearly. I'm still in Uganda. Maybe it's just that it's a new month, same year, but yeah, that's as new as it's gotten since we last met. And maybe the topic that we're yet to discuss
Mhm.
between then and now, we were talking youth and individual giving back then. That's bound to change this episode. So that's pretty much it.
Wow, wow, wow. That's very interesting. So to recap season 10, you did a very amazing job with the community podcast in season 10. Very, very lovely season on climate justice and action. And for those that are listening in for the first time, they would love to know. Let's start with the subject on climate and the diversity of guests you hosted in season 10. Would you like to share about that?
Yeah, sure. Climate is something that we're hearing a lot about lately, and it's easy to brush it off as, just another buzzword in civil society. But it's hard to brush off something you're actually experiencing, and it's a reality that we're actually facing, whether through floods, droughts, a spontaneous storm, some of the highest temperatures we've seen or felt so far. It's a glaring reality that we need to address. We can't run away from it. So it's not easy to brush it off as just a buzzword and another trending thematic area in civil society. So that's what season 10 covered. And more specifically, it zeroed in on the Philanthropy for Climate Movement, an initiative that is powered by Wings. And in that season, we had the privilege of sitting down with global leaders of foundations and institutions that have pledged to incorporate climate in their funding strategies. And yeah, there were very in depth conversations that we got into from leaders all over the world, from the Philippines to Brazil to the Arab Foundations Forum. There were just so many leaders and a vast amount of knowledge that they shared in that season. I would definitely encourage every listener to tune in and listen into those episodes. They're very insightful pieces. Yeah.
You've spoken about in-depth conversations and hinted on, the different regions from which the global leaders uh, were hosted. The question then would be, the community focuses on giving and generosity and the diverse forms in which that happens across the continent and now globally. Were there any outstanding lessons that you would pick from the season? Maybe two or three that you'd share with our listeners.
So the first lesson would be collective approaches are the way to go at the moment, in the sense that when it comes specifically to dealing with global issues like climate, fragmented philanthropy has no place in addressing such a global challenge. And that in itself does not negate the efforts of grassroots movements or local NGOs that are addressing these issues at a national level or even at district and village level. But such global movements and collectives at that level are very important in terms of strategizing and pooling uh, a huge amount of resources to drive change in places where it's most desired and in a very strategic and orderly manner. So I saw a lot of that in terms of how Wings is organizing these foundations and funders to consider and incorporate climate in their strategies and even explore ways of funding it in their different contexts with the goal of addressing the challenge that's before all of us. The second thing that stood out for me in season 10 is that there's no template for addressing crisis. So, in the absence of that kind of template, what do you fall back to? I think the answer was in many of those episodes it's to innovate. Innovation is the only way out of crisis. And talking to these global leaders and funders, I realized that most of their approaches were ignited by crisis and they did not fall back to what was in their strategies. They had to fall back to the level of their creativity and they had to do something quickly to respond to these issues that were, springing up left, right, and center in terms of the climate crisis, from wildfires to floods. They had to, rise to the occasion without falling back to their typical, program activities and their neat documents. They just had to think in the moment and innovate. I recall Miss Nevgul Safkan from the Sabanchi Foundation in in Turkey. She talked about having set up an emergency fund as a foundation when Turkey was suffering a series of wildfires. So that was not initially in their plan. They had, more organized and proactive ways of funding, but such a situation called for thinking out of the box. And they went on to, set aside some money to address the wildfires that were springing up in that time. She also talked about film festivals that were happening, annually, and all these film festivals tended to be around issues that are affecting society at the time. So they had the opportunity to partner with young film stakeholders, and they set up a climate-specific film festival, which, had the opportunity to document and to raise awareness about the impact that the climate crisis was having on Turkey. The other one, which I found really interesting, was the Alana Foundation. That's from Brazil, yes. So they produced two TV series and they were showing on Netflix, which is, such a cool and hip idea. And I think it's innovative in the sense that it's relevant to the times, and that's something that people can easily catch on to, and you just never know where you'll find your audience. So they produced two TV series that were documenting the impact of the climate crisis in Brazil. So that's another way that innovation was springing up in these conversations. And finally, the Gigaton Challenge. We interviewed, I think there were 3 Gigaton teams from Uganda, Zambia, and South Africa. And they were reducing emissions through collecting food waste and doing it in phases, in teams, in collectives, and repurposing this food waste, yes, to reduce emissions, but to also tackle the issue of food insecurity that springs from, the climate crisis and climate change issues. So they were solving 2 things at a time. And I found that very impressive from this particular season.
Wow, wow. Season 10 is a very wealthy season of the community podcast. And indeed, like you've said, from mobilizing resources through starting funds to the innovation that comes through film and different festivals, to also being part of Netflix and innovation through the Gigathon Challenge. Season 10 is rich. So if you're listening in for the first time, this is a good moment to pause and check us out at CivSource Africa on any of the social media platforms and get to tap into the diversity of giving and the innovation that is happening around the globe. I also know that CivSource Africa has hosted the Gathering of Givers the previous year, which focused on, uh, earth calling and responding with seeds of generosity. So if you can just dash to your YouTube, tap into that and watch the Gathering of Givers 2022. That was an amazing one on environment. So as we get back to the questions, Madonna, when listening to the different guests from across the globe, are there some features that you felt, were common? Whether you are interviewing someone in Turkey, someone in Philippines, or the Elena Foundation in Brazil, do you find any common threads in how giving towards climate justice and action is happening around the globe?
Yeah, there are definitely common threads, but I think that's even imposed by the nature of the climate crisis. It's affecting our home, the earth. It's it's a global concern, it's a personal concern. So everyone has buy-in in one way or another because we all live here. We may be in different parts of the continent, but it's all home in our different contexts. So I found that there was a certain level of passion that was driving these leaders, both in the global north and the global south. As we had these conversations, they had the earth at heart, and were doing all they could to address the challenges. That's from the Gigaton Challenge participants that were, addressing it from the food security and emissions perspective, and then giving their time and resources for that. And then the funders that were giving, still strategizing, bringing the human resource together to think through strategies that would enable them direct their funding in a more strategic and orderly manner to address this on a global scale. So I think the fact that the climate crisis affects all of us and the earth where we all reside, there's a bit of unity. There's a lot of unity and buy-in in this particular season. Um, the second thing that seemed to cut across was the community and collective approaches to philanthropy. I think that stood out a lot in this particular season. Um, and it means a lot to us, especially as Africans, because we have a lot of, collaboration and a sense of community going ground, from Harambe to our merry-go-round collection approaches. And in this case, you could see the Arab Foundations Forum that's coming together with think tanks, funders, foundations of all kinds, just thinking together to see, okay, how do we incorporate this in our strategies? How do we direct our funding to address this challenge? They are bringing their minds together in this, and even with Wings as a whole, um, inviting all these foundations to come together and pledge their commitment to drive philanthropy for climate. That in itself was something that ran across um, all the listeners, all the guests that were hosted from across the globe.
That's very interesting, Madonna. As an organization, I know CivSource Africa is passionate about African philanthropy. As you listen through the different episodes and hosted the different guests from across the globe, did this speak to anything that you think we would adopt as organizations on the continent that seek to advance the cause of African philanthropy?
Yeah, there's a lot to take from it, and which was really what I was going to talk about as a key takeaway for me was, as African organizations, I think we need to drop the Messiah complex. Let me choose to call it that. the feeling that, you need to prove yourself as the hero for the entire continent or your nation, that ultimately you're doing all these things to get the affirmation to yourself as an individual. I think we need to allow more collaboration. Yes, we have that sense of community, but I think because of how civil society is structured, that's kind of changing to be maybe even more competitive and individualistic. So I think that we need to drop that complex and allow ourselves to collaborate more with people that feel the same way, because there's so many like-minded people that you can work with, like-minded organizations that you can work with. And if there's anything I've taken away from this season, it is that the more funders and people you have on board, the more effective the movement will be. And if it's a global crisis you're trying to solve, the best way about it is not to, do it alone, but to be as global, as community centered, as collaborative as can be.
Wow. Okay. So, philanthropy, love for humanity, generosity, giving. Someone listening in today may be wondering, okay, I know you've convinced me throughout the past uh, 9 episodes that I'm a philanthropist, that the different forms through which I give matter, and that it's not about the size of how I give and whether or not I'm giving money. And now here we are talking about climate justice and action. If there's one person listening in today that you'd want to encourage to make the most of their time, of their talent, of their finances, or of even their ability to mobilize communities around climate justice and action, what would you tell them? What would you want them to know?
I will reiterate something that I learned while hosting Team Zamkanda, that there was the Zambian team, I think, that was doing the Gigaton challenge. And I think they asked something similar to me after I'd hosted them on the podcast. And their response was, you can actually start as an individual before you go to the collective. Um, how do you know, deal with your waste at home? Do you take, that meticulous step of separating the plastics from the decomposable waste? That would be the first step that you take. And then when you get a better understanding of that at that level, when you're responsible at an individual level, then you can move on from there to grow a movement, to participate in the very many campaigns that are always happening. Check out social media. And on the Ugandan scale, there are very many climate justice advocates that are always running campaigns, whether it's planting a tree, whether it's cleaning up places and getting rid of plastics, whether it's recycling campaigns. There are so many ways that you can contribute, on a more collective scale. So beyond giving your finances, that's one of the ways, being part of collectives that are giving their time, their talent, and treasure to recycle, to clean up their environment, to plant trees under whose shade you may never see it. Yeah, that would be it.
Wow, wow. To plant trees under whose shade we may never sit. That's a very, very, very key statement you've mentioned there, Madonna. So for those that are listening in to the community podcast for the first time, and you might have caught this episode as the first episode you've ever listened into, please feel free to reach out to CivSource Africa. CivSource is CivSource Africa, on any of our social media platforms, and check out the community podcast. And are you part of any collective? Are you an individual that gives back to your community in diverse ways? We want to tell your story. Please reach out to us on any of our social media platforms, and let's get to share in the good that you are doing across the continent. Madonna, it's been a pleasure hosting you again. I do not know if we'll have another chance for you to take part in the season 11, but yeah, it's been awesome hosting you today, yet again.
And it's been a pleasure reflecting on these amazing stories. I definitely encourage our listeners to revisit and recap these episodes that we shared. It would be a very insightful tuning in or listening party, if you call it. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah. Okay, then we wish you all the best. Enjoy the warmth of Kampala, and dear listeners, wherever you are, please continue to enjoy the community and share this with a friend. And yeah, enjoy, share stories on giving and generosity in your own space. We would love to spotlight those once again. So please feel free to reach us on any of our social media platforms at CivSource Africa. Have a blessed day.